welcome to Misteyre Creations. I'm your host AJ. Today we're speaking with Joshua Cutchin again. We are discussing little people, mound builders, and Joshua's current works. Please join us. What do you think of collective unconscious explaining how cross cultures have similar folklore, gods, that sort of thing? Do you think is it its own intelligence, or is it a collective unconsciousness? Or, I mean,
Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if this idea of collective unconsciousness is what we're trying to drive at when we talk about God and things like that. I really don't know. I think that in my experience, I've looked at too much stuff that has popped up across the world at a time when there wasn't cultural transmission to say that there's nothing to the idea of the collective unconscious. There is something to that idea. And it's kind of frustrating to me when I run into I find this with ufologists sometimes, or just paranormalists in general, I guess. Um, I find it frustrating when I run into people who find that to not be an amazing possibility that all these things, come from the collective unconscious, because that's still a miraculous thing. The idea that as a human being, um, you come into this world with software already downloaded
yeah,
into your framework, that we all have this, and there's always going to be the trickster and the crone and the mother and the warrior, and like all these different sort of archetypes. I think that's wild to me, and I think that is the supernatural by any other name. um so I do think that the collective unconscious plays a huge role in this. I've recently become very enamored by something that my good friend Ren Collier said. Ren is an occultist, and
mm,
he made an illusion at an event that we were at a couple months ago, that he believed that the spirits were made up of story. And the more I think about that, the more I sit with that, the more I think that's really profound, because this idea of um of spirits being made up of story, and I would sort of extend that concept to of spirits to UFO phenomenon and to Bigfoot phenomenon. The idea that they're made up of story is sort of a reflection of that internal, external, physical, non-physical dichotomy that we were talking about earlier,
yeah,
right? Like the idea that it could be made up of the idea that story plays an important role in this is just something that I think is really, really fascinating. And that's part of the reason that I think that you can't completely dismiss a lot of those early UFO contactees. Like I think a lot of them patently like went off the rails and kind of started saying some really kooky things, and fabrication, lies, deception, etc. But I think a lot of them had something um initially, or several select moments throughout their experiences, encountered something strange, and sort of all the sort of stuff we're left with is their sort of um kooky interpretations, and sort of the cult of personality that they built up around themselves. But again, like the fact that they are building up this sort of personalized mythology around their original experiences is again tying into this idea of these things being story. And if these things are story, then that is pretty much as close as you're going to get before you say that they are part of or from the collective unconscious. Um, and I tell you what, like it's easy to sort of poo-poo the idea of archetypes until they come into your life
yeah,
full-fledged. Um, but you do encounter this sometimes, and it kicks your tail. I mean, I we mentioned before we started recording about the time that I spent in rehab for alcoholism in 2020, and The reason that I got out of that in one piece was because I sat and journaled, and I tried to take an archetypal view of my life and my experience and where I was, and I was able to sort of, pinpoint that I was in the belly of the whale, and from that Joseph Campbell sort of perspective, but what that does is it also gives you a template for how to handle what happens next, and for how to integrate what has happened and where you are and because I do feel like a lot of these narratives, the hero's journey, and I don't even mean that in a gendered way, just the person's journey to becoming a full person. Um, I think that that is a well-worn rut
Mm,
in the landscape of existence. And call it the universe, call it God, call it what we will, wants you to travel in that rut.
yeah,
It wants you to have these ups and downs, and it wants you to go through that cycle. And once you can recognize that, it can be a very powerful tool in finding your footing, I think. And we ignore that, I believe, at our own peril.
it happens quite often. Um, great personal change uh, comes at the cost of sacrificing who you were.
Yeah, and that's the thing we don't like as a modernized society. We want something for nothing, and you know, um, as I'm sure you noticed in your NDEs, and something I noticed in that sort of rebuilding process that I had after that, like it's a significant down payment that you have to make to have that sort of lasting change.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I was about to say half measures have not availed us, and then I realized I was pulling straight from the AA book. But I mean, there's a lot of truth. Well, AA is kind of a spiritualism
Yeah.
influenced discipline anyway. But there's truth in that. Like whatever this thing is, the phenomenon, to use it singularly, is interacting with whatever it is that we're interacting with. It it requires a down payment of some sort, and that's why this is something that the late Jeff Ritzman talked about at length, um, about how you can go out and have a lot of these experiences, but for a lot of people, they do extract a price, and either you've paid that price beforehand or you pay it afterwards, and that might take on a lot of different looks.
Yeah.
It might be something like giving up something that you love to do. It might look like a health cost. It might look like um, falling into this sort of obsessive chapel perilous that a lot of researchers fall into. I've seen it happen time and time again, where all they can think about are these phenomena.
Yeah.
Um, and but there usually is some price tag at the other end of it, and I don't know why that is. It seems to have something to do with the fact that this is a liminal, tricksterish sort of phenomenon, but it does seem to um, it wants something in return. And that sounds sinister. It doesn't have to be,
Mm,
because, a lot of times if a lot of times some of the best things in your life can come out of some of the worst times in your life, or some of the biggest changes. So it doesn't have to be sinister, but I do think that there is a give and take. And that's been alluded to throughout, you know, pagan traditions, Abrahamic traditions,
yeah.
Eastern traditions, this idea of offerings and sacrifice and all this stuff. I think that really is what it's alluding to, is that in order to get the attention of the other world of the phenomenon, you have to sort of offer something before you can facilitate that open channel of communication.
True. Um, I've experienced some, I've had a really weird life. Uh, but just before COVID, around late 2019, I got really sick, and
Hmm.
I've never ever prayed in my life uh, for something for people around me. And like it's usually been personal thing. that sort of thing. But in this case, I just prayed for my wife and our pet to be safe because
Mhm.
I knew when I went to bed that night I wasn't gonna get up. That's how I was feeling. And I went to sleep, and this, the guy from Wild Hunt, the guy with the bird
Yeah,
and the antlers. I saw a mix of him and Pan. He chased me for a while, and I was scared of him because I was like, "Oh my God, I'm gonna die," because Wild is chasing me. And
right.
I stopped by the edge of a river, and I knew I couldn't go into that river. And I turned, and he had a bowl in his hand and said, "Find balance." Handed me the bowl. I took the bowl, woke up, and threw up dark ink, what looked like dark ink, out of my lungs. And I started immediately feeling better. That is an initiatory experience right there,
Yeah, yeah, it is.
and multiple archetypes there.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing that like a lot of people who approach these topics from this purely materialistic, you know, this colonel was at this Air Force base on this date that lines up with this UFO crash. It they miss how, they look at this stuff and they just sort of they would look at a story like the one you just shared and they'd say, oh, it's just a bunch of crazy blue stuff, and they'd move on. But what happens once you sort of, you know, embed yourself into this sort of symbolic landscape that a lot of these things unfold in, like everything about what you just said makes perfect sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Um, it really just it's so consistent. Um, and that is, absolutely fascinating. And I think that what you sort of touched on there might be the real key to what we're sort of dancing around here, is you made an allusion to praying for others for the first time. I think that the not even abandonment, because that implies you'll never get it back, but the weakening or the making peace with the possible loss and eventual definite loss of ego, I think is an important aspect to this, which is probably why you get, miraculous things happening to people who have attained that state, regardless of, the particular spiritual discipline, is because they sort of separated themselves from that ego. And that's what a rehab experience is. That's what a near death experience is. It's that sort of death and rebirth uh, motif expressing itself. And in the wake of that, like again, my time, I came back and it was a very weird season of my life in terms of just the most profound synchronicities, and just there was just a lot of oddness that popped off in the wake of that. And it's because I think there was that sort of that's just what happens in the aftermath of the death rebirth narrative.
yeah. You're in that liminal space
Right.
mentally as much as
Yeah,
physically.
and I think it does have kind of a half-life. Like it's hard to hold on to. I think there's some people who just are in that space all the time, but for somebody like me, it did have this sort of uh I guess the best way is the way I just said it, the sort of half-life. If you're familiar with, like, isotopic decay, like, with stuff happening every day, and then something would happen every week, and then every month, and then, until the point that it just tapers off so much. But yeah, it's it's a way to experience these things, that's for sure. Not the easiest way, but again, thinking about a metaphor that I like to employ a lot is this idea in alchemy of the alchemical transformation, which was ostensibly about turning lead into gold, but was kind of just a regime for self-improvement.
Mhm.
Um, the dry way and the wet way. The dry way was fast but volatile, and the
Yeah,
wet way was slow and steady, but was kind of the safer route. And I think that I think you can extend that metaphor to things like psychedelic experiences or near-death experiences or personal spiritual disciplines, depending how you perceive it each. I think that's a useful metaphor in terms of interacting.
Um, what about mycelium? Have you ever thought of there's some research that's kind of showing that mycelium have consciousness, um, and they kind of mirror the 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 collective consciousness thing in how they interact with basically all life on the planet. Um, what are your thoughts on if mycelium effect can affect humans?
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea. I think it you just can't escape you just can't escape the mushroom. You know what I mean? Like if you look at its long-standing ties to fairy folklore, not only in Western Europe but worldwide. Um, there's the connection to altered states of consciousness. There's this unshakable sense that it's somehow tied to the UFO question, if only by the shape of their caps and the work of Terence McKenna. Um, it's there is this sense that that there's something cosmic in that sense about the mushroom. Um, and I see the idea of a vast mycelium network that we are interfacing with, that we're sort of perhaps even being used by,
Yeah.
not in a negative way necessarily, but being used by or being symbiotic with. I think that that's sort of an elegant hermeneutic sort of idea, right? As above, so below. It's almost like a macrocosm of human consciousness, which for all we know is a macrocosm of, the living universe. I don't know, but I think it's a really cool idea, and it's something that should get more exploration than it has, because one of those things, I listen to those old Terence McKenna lectures, and you hear this from other psychonauts as well, but like the idea that these different entheogens and psychedelic substances would have their own character implies that there's some sort of identity behind each of these different modalities of altering one's consciousness, and I think that's just really, really interesting. So yeah, I definitely think it's a possibility. My research hasn't gone in that direction, but I can see how it would play well with my other interpretations. Yeah.
Well, looking at mycelium structure and then looking
Mhm.
at recent finds of dark matter spider webs throughout the universe, very much in the same way that mycelium spread. And
Hmm.
when you look at the neurons of the brain, it's a similar structure.
Yeah, yeah, that's part of what I love about that is, and that's one of those things that I'm going to endeavor to teach my sons as they grow older, is this microcosm macrocosm thing. The fact that a leaf looks like a branch and the branch looks like the tree, and then you can look at the human cardiovascular system and all this stuff. Just there are these certain forms and functions that I think repeat themselves and are in that sense divine. But the idea that the mycelium might mirror the human brain, I think is a powerful observation. And I think it does deserve more speculation. Well, I mean, even if you look at the UFO occupants themselves have been people who have touched the grays, um, with setting aside, the objective nature of that form. People have compared their skin to being sort of mushroom-like, and their textures, and they kind of look like little mushroom people. So yeah, it I'm vastly more sympathetic to that than I am the extraterrestrial thing at this point for the UFOs.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe the Tic Tacs are spores from this from this gigantic mycelium network. I love it.
That'd be interesting to find evidence of. That would be
Yeah,
that'd be great.
no, there's never going to be any evidence of that. I'm pretty sure.
No.
I think that I think that us talking about these cultural expectations that play into the way that the phenomenon manifests. I think that really has a great deal of influence on a lot of this discussion we're having of crashed UFO retrievals. I mean, I mentioned this in Ecology of Souls too, but we've always gotten artifacts from whatever this thing is that correspond to what we think it is, right? Like a lot of people that I know um, who claim interactions regularly with the good folk um, don't think that they really need fairy chalices like you might find at some of these churches stolen from a fairy hoard in the Netherlands. They don't think that fairies really need these tiny little fairy boots made out of mouse skin like were found on the Berea Peninsula in Ireland in the 1800s. They don't think that they really need fairy flags, but we still have these things. Saints relics are another good example. Like, if you look at the finger bones of Saint X or Saint Y, you'll find out that the saint had 20 fingers. So obviously there's some frauds in there, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
but these things often still display miraculous abilities to those who believe in them, like healing them and becoming animated. There's a famous example of the one saint's blood which is coagulated but always turns back into liquid on the date of their birth or their death or something like that. So like these things seem to be fraudulent in some sense, but they also have these anomalous qualities. And I think that the crash material, if we ever get a look at it, might be along the lines of something like that, or like an apport that you get from a seance or a poltergeist.
Yeah.
I think. I don't know. I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong about this, but
Well,
yeah.
fairy folk, you ask the fairy folk if you've lost something, you ask them, and a lot of times you ask and you receive the item that you're looking for.
Well, that's the cool thing about it is because I know so many people who are trying to make all this make sense and make all of it reconcile. And once you start entertaining the idea that this is somehow coming from, as we've talked about multiple times here, story or the collective unconsciousness or imagination, like then it can be anything and it can do anything. And it also goes away, I think, to explaining the incidence of something like high strangeness, which is clearly seems to me at least to be operating in this realm of dream logic that has much more to do with the unconscious and all this other stuff than it does, oh well, the uh the Greys need their 18,000th soil sample, you know, from this location so that they can do this or that. It seems to make more sense that we are operating in this sort of realm of, again, things like story and symbolism and stuff like that. So things like meat showers, like I don't know what that is. I think that's, and yes, I've heard all the explanations and I could recite them to you chapter and verse, but like if we are to interpret them as anomalous, like I don't know if there is any greater purpose to it other than being anomalous, other
Mhm.
than being strange.
And that's what it seems like. Strangeness for the sake of strangeness to make people change their thought process in that time period, that experience.
Right. Well, that's another thing that I've been playing with lately is that I'm not entirely sure that there is, if that's not the purpose of all this stuff.
Yeah.
Like I look at a lot of these things, and the fact that we don't have a smoking gun for any of it. I mean, we can talk about Bigfoot tracks and we can talk about great cases, whatever. That's not what I mean. Like, I'm not always sure that there's a there with the UFO or with the Bigfoot, but I know that there's a there here, and I see the changes that whatever that thing is. Um, I see the changes of whatever that thing is manifesting in the person who perceives it, and I kind of have to step back and say maybe that's the point of all this, you know.
That well, for me, the experiencer, the change that it causes, a lot of times a lot of times it's a positive change unless the person's psyche is on the road of it's bad. It
It
has to
has
be
to be
bad.
integrated. It
Yeah.
has to be integrated. You have to address the Jungian shadow and all that stuff. And you have, and quite frankly, like you have to be given your culture has to give you a framework for it, and our culture doesn't do that. So of course, a lot of people uh, slip by the wayside when you don't have that sort of support structure, which is why I think what's so interesting about these cultures in which shamanism is practiced is that there is a framework for it, and there is a means of understanding and sort of giving these people a role in the community, and we don't do a very good job with that. In the again the modern West. Yeah,
I think in the industrial industrialization and the push away from nature kind of stunted
yeah,
Western world. It it separated us from what this other is trying to punctuate for us that we are kind of connected.
yes, and I would say, um, as a Christian, I think Christianity has had a role in that too.
Mm,
I would be a little bit more granular and a little bit more specific, and I would say that the application of Christianity over the centuries has had a role in furthering that gap as well, more than the actual religion itself, if that
yeah.
makes sense. Um, yeah, and I think that if you can have all the best blueprints in the world, but if no one gives you the space to build the building and no one gives you any supplies, you're like, well, I got these blueprints, I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to have some support there, or it's just gonna collapse.
Um, food in these experiences, like uh, there was this. See, one of the first UFO uh instances that I came across. I'm gonna forget it, but is there's this farmer who they invite
Yep.
him into their ship pancakes and they taste horrible
Yep.
because they don't
The
have
the
any
the Joe
salt.
Simonton case of Eagle River, Wisconsin, yeah, in the 60s. I think maybe 64. Yeah, I mean that's a classic one, and that was sort of like one of that sort of trend was one of the things that prompted me to write my first book, A Trojan Feast, is the fact that there is food and drink exchange in these encounters, and I've seen it mentioned elsewhere that it doesn't happen very often, and that's just not true. Especially if you broaden the definition to include things like ointments or injections, things that are meant to be taken into the body. Like it happens all the time. My unique interpretation of that is that it's not really so much about the actual food or drink or medicine from a pharmacological or nutritional standpoint. It is more about that sort of, to use a Whitley Strieberism, that sort of communion with these other beings, and that um, there is sort of an invitation into becoming one with these things, um, in this ancient archetypal sense of eating the god, which some people might know from certain tribes that would ingest the flesh of their vanquished foes to take on their power, or eat certain things to sort of take on the power of that. You can see a aspect of that manifest in the Christian communion. It was also the case in these entheogens like ayahuasca and whatever soma was. There was this idea that you were actually ingesting the deity yourself,
Mhm.
to bring you to be more like them. And I think that is probably what's going on here. Whether that's literal or metaphorical, I'm not sure, but I do think that it's something about extending consciousness in that regard and becoming not one with, but becoming of the same quality, becoming alike these things that you're encountering. I think that's a distinct possibility. And it does happen, it happens more often than you'd expect. Let's put it that way. It happens often enough to write a book about it. But yeah, I think that probably is what we're seeing. Again, if we're playing in these archetypal symbolic waters. I think that's what's happening in a lot of these cases.
Um, I remember a story a friend told me. Um, he had a dream where he saw these people that had died,
Mhm.
and it was uh, a situation where in the dream they had died, and then he met them as dead people in his hometown, but the hometown was different, it was older, and they invited him to dinner, and he knew if he ate, he would be stuck there.
I mean, that's literally beat for beat some of these older fairy narratives,
Yeah,
right? Like you know that, right? Like
yeah,
like it's they spend a night with the good folk and they come back and they don't recognize their town and generations have passed and they finally sit down to eat and then they first bite causes time to catch up and they crumble into dust. I mean, you hear that a lot. And um, I there is something about being a part or being a piece of the place that you consume food. There's this letter that just recently got some attention online that I've been mentioning here and there, which is from the correspondence between Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And Tolkien puts forth this really interesting idea, which is the idea that part of the reason that we don't see nymphs and dryads and things like that is because we're not putting in our bodies things that are connected to the land on which we reside. Like even back then, he was like, you can have your deli meat from Italy and your tomatoes from, somewhere else and some fruit grown in the tropics, and you're not eating anything that is local and that is actually from the land that you're in. So that makes you somehow deadened to being in touch with that land. So again, it's that idea of uh, of being a part of the space that you're in when you consume the food from that space. And I think that's a really interesting idea. Whether or not it's true, I think there's some metaphorical value to it. Yeah.
um, in the ecology of souls, you mentioned the things people see when they are in beautiful or when they go to beautiful lands are like there's bridges and whatnot,
Mhm.
and they find that they can't cross or they shouldn't cross or they feel like they shouldn't cross. Um, there's it seems to be like a rule. You don't cross this river. Like in my dream, I knew if I crossed that,
Right,
I'd be gone. So,
right.
so do you think that rule exists, or is it just our minds playing on us?
I mean, the number of times that you see the boundaries of the afterlife or the other world delineated by impassable landmarks like rivers and chasms and mountains and such, it's such a universal idea that I think that there might be something to it. Whether or not it's actually like um, it's a literal feature, or if it's our mythopoetic way of internalizing the concept of a barrier, or um, a lot of times you see these features as ultimatums, like the point of making an ultimatum. If you cross this, then you will never be able to go back, that sort of thing. Um, it whether it's a literal barrier or it's just our way of internalizing that threshold or internalizing that ultimatum. I'm not sure. But it does seem to be related to other bodies of folklore where vampires and fairies couldn't cross running bodies of water either, because there's that sense that they are um, of that other space, and that somehow, even if they are in our world, crossing a boundary or threshold is something that they cannot do to exit that other space. So yeah, it is so consistent though, that I can't help but think that there's some sort of truth to it, literal truth or metaphorical truth. That's anybody's guess, but you see it time and time and time again, and oftentimes the way across is a berry, a ferry or a bridge,
Yeah.
or or something along those lines, which has all sorts of uh, funereal or death related
Mm.
symbolisms and implications tied up.
Or if you go to Christianity, it's the forbidden fruit.
Yeah, it's this idea of you can't unring a bell. You know what I mean? Like when something is done, it is done. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and then the expulsion from the boundaries of Eden. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting the stories we tell ourselves to conceptualize our world. Um, to that extent, what is your favorite folklore, either region, type, or story?
Oh my goodness. Um, well, I can't not answer Western European fairy folklore because it's so much of what I delve into. Um, I've become recently quite enamored with Cherokee folklore from the American Southeast.
Mhm.
Um, Partially because when I look at some of these indigenous myths and some of the European stuff, it's so similar that I personally am left with two possibilities. The first, which I realize is probably the most likely, although I don't want to admit it all the time, is that there was cultural contamination on the behalf of European ethnographers who wanted to sort of fit Cherokee belief into that sort of Western fairy folklore.
Mhm.
But the other possibility, which I still maintain seems to be a distinct possibility, is that like these two bodies of folklore are so they bear such a strong resemblance because they're both describing something that they encountered and they're describing it in objective terms. Like the thing that I love is that you look at some of these Cherokee myths around their fairy people, which alternatively might be fairies or might be the Yumi Chunsi or might be the Nanyanahi, different varieties of fairies, which is again
Yeah.
something you see in other parts of the world as well. Um, is that you have incidences of missing time, um, references to living underground, in some instances references to short stature, but also something that you don't see as much in the new world as you do in the old world are associations with earthworks. Mounds that were constructed either um, as gathering points for a community or burial mounds, both. And you see that all over Europe, and you also see it in the Cherokee stuff too. The Nanyanahi being associated with these earthworks, and there's one great story of a Nanyanahi townhouse, is what they refer to them as, known as Setsi, and it was basically when you read the story, it sounds like according to the story, the Nanyanahi came to the community and said, "If you're all silent, you can come live with us, but we're moving our townhouse, so don't make any sounds when we move our townhouse." And the townhouse levitates up into the air, so you've got a flying mound in the air, right? Sounds a lot like a UFO.
Yeah.
The flying down in the air, and then it's so frightening that the people in the village shriek, and then the Cherokee, the Nanyanahi rather townhouse, the mound falls on top. Which kind of sounds like a UFO and a UFO crash. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Um, so I do find that body of folklore so interesting, and just the fact that like I'm sure there has to be somewhere. I've yet to find it, and I keep every now and then I put out the call, but I'm sure that there's some sort of old diary somewhere of an Irish settler in America driving by some of these indigenous North American mounds and being like, they have them here too, because
Yeah.
you look at some of these mounds that you see throughout America, and they bear such a strong resemblance to these old world fairy forts and these fairy hills. I mean, I have a presentation, and at one point I throw up a slide of a picture of an Irish fairy fort contemporary, and I also have a picture of one of the mounds closest to me, the Etowah Mounds, prior to its preservation. So it's just a field with some cows in front, and there are trees all over the mountain. I said, okay, which is the North American mound and which is the fairy fort, and no one can ever identify them because they look practically identical. So I
Okay.
think that's really interesting too. Yeah.
Um, I'm doing some study into the Appalachia area because I'm from Nova Scotia, which is one of the northernmost ends of that range before you get to
Yeah.
Europe.
And
And
it's one of the places that fairy fate survived the most intact
yeah,
from the trip over the Atlantic. Yeah.
yeah, oh, there's stories of a man in Prince Edward Island that in I think it was the 1940s. He had problems with alcoholism because came back from the war hurt and then he wandered out into the swamp at night on I think it was November 1st
Yeah,
and
one of the fairy days. Yeah.
one of the fairy days and disappeared for 3 months. And when he came back, he had no memory of where he'd been and wouldn't speak. He for
Yep.
the rest of his days he didn't speak a word at all and uh didn't though later people asked him about the experience and it seemed like he remembered something but he wouldn't talk about it.
Hmm. I
So
mean, that tracks, doesn't it? Yeah. Have you seen that documentary from you can find it on YouTube. It's just called The Fairy Fate,
I
and
think
it's about this guy who's comparing the Scottish beliefs to the beliefs in Nova Scotia. And it's
yeah,
one of my, I haven't watched it in a while. I used to watch it like annually, but it's one of my favorites. Yeah.
right on. It's those stories I remember a lot of them uh growing up. Um we have this folklore, this there's stories that the Mi'kmaq told of 6 foot tall, blonde hair, blue eyed native people uh in the Prince Edward Island area. And that
Hmm.
when the Spanish came, they killed them all off because they thought they were devils.
Hmm.
And that story, I don't think I've heard it outside of Nova Scotia, but
There's some illusions. I live not far from another indigenous site called Fort Mountain, here in North Georgia, and it's this the remains of this long wall, and it's been speculated to be indigenous, and it's been speculated to be from Hernando de Soto. Cherokee and Creek legends will tell you that it was uh, built, or that it was part of, it was associated with the Moon-Eyed people, which are this group of beings or people that some people say they sound like Welsh uh, settlers that came over here in the pre-Columbian era. I look at those legends and they sound a bit more like some form of fairy folk to me, but you do hear that from time to time in different places. Yeah.
that that makes me think the stories of King Arthur. Uh, there's Avalons everywhere on the on the East Coast. In Nova Scotia, there's the Avalon Peninsula where
Huh.
there's this treasure that was buried, and everyone's been looking for it, but they've never found it. And
Yeah, I had never really considered
Appalachia.
that, but I think we have this idea that like we're the only time in history that there's been this transportation of goods over great distances. But again, looking at some of these North American mounds, you've got there's representations in some of the mounds down here in the American Southeast of pipes that have an effigy of an ape on there. And so the idea is that like, well, apparently there was some sort of trade route that brought a monkey up from South America. Like that's the only thing that they can figure.
Mhm.
Um, and this past summer, I had the good fortune of going to Cahokia in St. Louis. And I remember standing there and looking at listening to the tour and looking at one of the fields where they pulled up some of the artifacts, and they mentioned a copper plate that they believed was fashioned at Etowah, which again is the mound that's like 30 minutes from where I live. And I'm standing there and I'm like, it took us 8 hours in a car going 70 miles an hour to get here from basically where this copper plate came from. And yet here, it was found here as well. So the amount of, the amount of trade and transportation that we as a species were capable of, I think we just don't quite, most of us today do not quite comprehend. Yeah.
True, true. Um, can you tell us a little bit about your new novel, The Old Ways Never Die? Or never.
Them old ways never died. Yeah, them old ways never died. Um, yeah, I wrote Ecology of Souls, and it was such a massive undertaking, and it was kind of, to a certain degree, it still is. I finally found some new stuff to say, but it was such a snapshot of the way that I thought about these phenomena at the time that I was like, well, what am I supposed to do next? And at the same time, I wanted to see if I could write fiction. The degree to which I succeeded, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder. But I'm pleased with what I've done, and I did it for me, so that's enough, I suspect.
Yeah.
But it's I wanted to. There were so many different factors that made me end up wanting to write it. Another part of it was I wanted to have some of these experiences that I've heard other fictional authors talk about where they have a character that they try to get do things and then the character actually comes to them and says, "No, I'm not doing that in your story." I had a little bit of that happen. Sometimes at the cusp of sleep, there would be these ideas that would just come to me um, that I still can't to this day say exactly where they came from. They just feel like they came from, you know, felt like I was downloaded. There was a section of the book a chapter that I needed to rewrite, and I remember rewriting it at the suggestion of my editor, Barbara Fisher. I remember rewriting it, and the feeling wasn't that I got it wrong the first time. The feeling was that I'd like mistranscribed it the first time, if that makes any sense. Like, it's like I got the transmission garbled. Um, but I also wanted to tell a story with some generational aspects. I also wanted a story where there was sort of a supernatural antagonist, but there were also the supernatural antagonist was a metaphor for something else that the protagonist had to go through. I always find those stories really interesting. And I also wanted to tell a story that was kind of a horror story involving fairies that got most of the fairy folklore correct because so much of it
Yeah.
doesn't. um, and it doesn't, it doesn't have to be that way. I'm not, a literalist when it comes to being like, well, you can't change things for artistic expression. Like I think that sometimes things need to be changed and adjusted. But I wanted to see what a fairy centered novel would look like if it actually tried to incorporate a lot of this folklore in an honest way, and also some of the ideas that connect it to the UFO phenomenon as well. So it's about music. Write about what you know about. So of course the book is about addiction, musicianship, and fairies. I guess write
Yeah.
what you know about. Um, but there's a musician who is stuck in his house in North Georgia during the pandemic, and he's in a self-destructive spiral, and he slowly comes to realize that he isn't alone, and that there's something that is following him. And the story ends up spanning 120 121 years or something like that. Um, and you don't quite uh, realize why there are so many aspects set in the distant past until towards the end of the book, and then it all starts to come together. But those were just sort of a thumbnail sketch of it. I'm currently working with a good friend of mine and another author who has a great voice um, to produce an audiobook of Them Old Ways Never Die, and that should be done hopefully by the late summer. We should have that out. So I'll be
Awesome.
sure to keep everybody up to date on that.
All right. I'll have to get that. Talk when you're talking about that, your description of that story is the archetype of good stories and good storytelling. Basically, uh, the protagonist has to struggle and 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 then that struggle and self-improvement happens and whatnot,
Hmm.
and it just I I love those stories. Uh, One of my favorite authors, R.A. Salvatore,
Uh-huh. Yep. Yep.
The Drow series, how
Hmm.
the dark elf goes from his what he knows and then becomes the person that he is to become. It's
Hmm.
like 140 years of time in that process, and he's met so many people, been so many things, uh, and it's it's the iconic story is what it is. It's the archetype of the struggle.
Yeah, those are always my favorite books. The ones that had little nuggets of wisdom, um, stuck here and there that you could pull out and sort of apply to other parts of your life. I mean, T.H. White's The Once and Future King is a book like that for me. Oddly enough, a book by Craig Ferguson, the former late night host and stand-up guy, stand-up comedian, called Between the Bridge and the River is another book that has a lot of those moments for me. And quite frankly, there's another book that was a big influence on Them Old Ways Never Died, which was King of Morning, Queen of Day
Okay.
by I can't remember. I can never remember his name. Hold on, I'm gonna look it up here because uh I think it's important that it's to me, to my mind, one of the best fairy books that's out there. Yeah, King of Morning, Queen of Day by Ian McDonald. Does a really good job in terms of, like, sort of drawing together all these disparate elements of fairy folklore and putting them into a narrative, and also, quite frankly, has some nice little insights about life as well. So that was something else that I tried to accomplish over the course of the project.
Also, what I really liked is the fact that you're trying to put some of the actual folklore into the book by doing that.
Mhm.
Um, Looking at old folklore, particularly the Irish uh, small folk,
Mhm.
dark fairies are very dark, very scary,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and
I mean, and yeah, yeah. It's one of those constant battles that you have to fight when you talk about fairies and why they should be taken seriously. Is that popular culture has poisoned the well so badly that a lot of people just immediately jump to thinking of Tinkerbell. Yeah, yeah. It's just no.
you
It's
know,
a lot more complex than that. There's a reason that that exists, but that's not necessarily the most accurate interpretation. Yeah.
is there anything you'd like to promote?
Yeah, I would like to mention something that's coming up and will be here before we know it. Is starting on March 23rd. I'm teaching a 9 class course on the near-death experience. Through the Cosmos Institute. That's Cosmos with a K, cosmosinstitute.org. Um, it's going to be a it's going to be a weird near-death experience course, in the sense that, we're not going to be necessarily spending all 9 classes on the near-death experience, because I think it's important to, uh, much as I did in Ecology of Souls, put the near-death experience in dialogue with other contact modalities, and to see, I mean, yeah, we could spend a class on life reviews and a class on light beings and stuff like that, but it's so much more interesting to me to dive into some of our typical considerations and sorry, archetypal considerations and some of these other things that we normally don't think about being related to near-death experiences, because I think that there's something so fundamental and straightforward about the near-death experience, and it has a lot to teach us about all the ways that we interact with these different phenomena. So that's my class on the near-death experience at Cosmos Institute, Cosmos Institute with a K.org, for more information on that. And I believe enrollment will go all the way up until the day of the first class, which is March 23rd.
Perfect. I'll be in on that one.
Nice. Well, we'll be welcome to have you. It's going to be a lot of fun. I don't have enough good things to say about the people who are lining it up. And it's gonna, we're gonna bring in uh, one of the classes is going to be a question and answer session with Shirley Black, who is a multiple, like yourself, a multiple near-death experiencer, but who also, worked with Michael Persinger quite a bit. So that's just going to be a Q&A session day, and I think it's going to be enlightening for everybody involved. Got a lot of stuff special, a lot of special stuff planned.
Again, I want to thank Joshua Cutchin for coming on the show with us. He's a font of knowledge and a great person. I have links in the show notes for you to find his works and him. The Fae are interesting beings with rich folklore and should be looked into when doing paranormal investigations. The media tends to think we can't handle things outside the wheelhouse of current thought. Yes, some can't handle difference and change, but difference and change are part of life. Explore and experience new things. When something doesn't compute, don't try to explain it away. Sit with it a while and see what's truly there. We want to thank all of you who have been part of our community. Our show is here for you to experience new things and learn. The journey has been interesting so far, and we want your feedback and help. Please let us know what you want more of and what you want us to expand on. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time on Misteyre Creations.